there is no list of storytellers. There's just the opportunity for people to stand up and say anything about Charlie, amusing or otherwise, or serious or insightful. Please feel free. I'll start with. It didn't just die. Do you need to do something?
I need to hook you in.
Oh, okay.
All right. Turn you on.
I'll cut there.
Thanks, Ann. Thank you.
I'm more wired than I've ever been before. I'll tell a story. One of the great pleasures of working at LASP has been to. It's been a tremendous organization ever since I came here in 1967. And the very striking thing is that Charlie built an organization that someone of completely different characteristics, Dan Baker, could take over and thrive in it and continue its thriving. It's been a remarkable thing, a tremendous tribute to both Dan and Charlie. But something that Randy Davis at the symposium we had called Preserving the Past a few weeks back, where we talked to the current LASP employees about the way it used to be and how various things happen. And Randy Davis told a story that really, to me, epitomizes Charlie. And Randy has very graciously allowed me to tell the story instead of him. I hope I can do it as well. It involves John Kiley. Is John here? I know that John is in. John Kiley? He's not here right now. I know he's here. Anyway, he worked on Pioneer Venus. He was the orbital dynamics guy on Pioneer Venus. And when SME was getting cranked up, after Pioneer Venus had been in orbit for a little while, Randy, I think, recruited John to come work for us on SME. And so
From
John,
Ames.
I'm sorry?
From Ames.
From NASA Ames, yeah. And so John came out for an interview and he talked, did the usual thing and was talking with Charlie and Randy, and Charlie asked him if there was he had any questions. And John said, well, one thing I can't get clear in my head, what exactly is what does the organization of LASP look like? Do you have an organization chart? And Charlie, without an instant's hesitation, picked up the LASP telephone directory, which at the top said Charles Barth, director, and everyone else was listed alphabetically. And he said, here it is. So he was one organized guy, and he knew what everyone was doing, and encouraged everyone in the different ways, but the best possible ways. Do we have any? Is there anyone else? Dave Rush.
So I just want to say a couple of things about Dr. Barth. One is that I came here just 1 year after he did. I came here in 1966, and he was what was it? 64, 65? 65. And I was just a raw graduate student, had no idea what I was doing. And I took his course in ionospheric physics. And I went up to him afterwards and I said, boy, I kind of like this stuff. He said, well, come and work for me. Okay, I can do that. And to show you how good he really was, he could actually nurture me to a PhD. That was really something. And then he threw me out, after you get your PhD. I went to Michigan for 5 years, and he actually hired me back to work on SME. So this is, shows you how good he really was, right? That's make that happen. So in 1970, right in the middle of my graduate student career, we had our daughter was born, Sue and I, and Sherry was very disabled. As you probably know, it's a very traumatic thing. And I went in and relayed this to Dr. Barth several days after her birth. And he said, Dave, just take as much time as you need. We'll be here when you get back. And I'm sorry. I never forgot that, and I never will. But a great human touch, and a wonderful guy, and a great mentor. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
I'm Gary Thomas. I'm an old timer. Been here since 1967, which makes it 48 years, if I can still add correctly. I first met Charlie, you probably won't find this hard to believe, in 1962. Maybe that's over 50 years. We happened to be in Paris on a postdoc, my wife and I, right after I got my PhD. We were in Paris for that year in 1962 and 63. And Charlie was at an airglow meeting that was in a called the Palais Royal, which is a former French palace. But it was hosted by Marcel Nicolet, Barbier, and David Bates. Charlie was at that meeting, and he sought me out. He had heard about me from my PhD work. And we all went out to a Paris jazz cellar. I don't know if you know it. He was a great jazz fan. Charlie loved jazz. And we've been to several jazz concerts with Charlie. Charlie Orr, of course, knows all about it, about Charlie's musical taste. So that's when I first met him. And I returned to the U.S. After 1 year in Paris, and then I was in the U.S. Army for a couple of years. So Charlie tried to get me transferred to JPL as a Army lieutenant, first lieutenant. That didn't work. The Army turned him down. But Charlie didn't give up, because when I got out of the Army, Charlie made another offer to me to come and work at JPL. Well, this was shortly before he came to CU. Of course, he kept that in his pocket, I guess. Maybe he was planning to bring me with him or whatever. But anyway, I turned him down. I can believe, right? Turned John Barth down. I went to Aerospace Corporation for a couple of years. And during that time, Charlie came to LASP, became the director, and became not a full professor, but only an associate professor in the astrogeophysics department. Departments were really hard-nosed in those days. Yeah, he did become a professor the next year. Anyway, he made me a third offer. Well, the first one wasn't really an offer, and I took that, because CU-Boulder was sort of a dream for me. Becoming a professor was even more of a dream. So, I worked with Charlie on Ogle 5, Ogle 6, Mariner 7, Apollo 17, and SME. And we had many experiences, collaborative experiences in those days. After SME, we kind of parted scientific paths a little bit. But when Charlie stepped down in 1992, I became the interim director for a year and a half. And just as Dan said, Charlie never interfered except once. It wasn't exactly interference, but he came into my office and gave me some advice. Turned out I didn't take it. He didn't hold it against me. It wasn't a big deal. But other than that, he did not interfere with any of the decisions that Ian and I made. And Ian was my associate director, and I couldn't have done the job without Ian. So, Ian, thanks very much for saving my life during that year and a half being an interim director. The last time I saw Charlie was a couple of years ago, and he was very enthusiastic about Google Mars. And took me into his office and showed me what he and Karen had been cooking up Pretty exciting stuff. Pretty exciting stuff. He always put science first. He was my. He was my hero. Now I'm getting emotional. I was shocked to hear about his death. It was a real surprise. Charlie was, apart from my family, the most important person in my life. And my debt to him is enormous. And I just can't imagine not seeing him walking through the halls, showing me his latest project. Always admire Charlie. He's goodbye to my friend and my mentor. There'll never be another man like him, as far as that concerned.
I'm George Lawrence. I came to LASP in 1970, met Ian and Gary and all the existing people. I just want to quickly mention a few things about Charles Barth. He'd come into a project, he'd sit down with the crew and say, what's our success plan? We'd go through the tall poles, and people would buy off on what appeared to me to be impossible jobs. And then he'd say, okay, go do it. And to my surprise, it got done. He used his executive council meetings as preparation for battles with the dean. He'd rehearse them with us, and we'd ask the hard questions. As a scientific mentor, one story, I got some data from Ian Stewart that he'd got from the Russians, Krasnopolsky group, from their Venera data around Venus. And there was a beautiful spectrum with equal spaced peaks through the visible region of the spectrum from the night glow of Venus. And the Russians couldn't figure out what it was. So I sat in my office and figured it out. And what had happened was their instrument had shifted 50 angstroms in the wavelength calibration, so the wavelengths they were trying to fit to known spectra didn't work. And then we said, well, it's coming from O plus CO recombination in the night atmosphere of Venus. And maybe we can do it in the lab. And we set up to do it in the lab, and Vic Argabright did it. And Charles Barth got involved in here, and he put his 8th meter Hebert Fasti in the lab so we could get a spectrum in the lab. Worked fine, and we compared the two, and you could hardly see the shift. And I said, well, let's write this up, and I wrote up the 50 angstrom shift, and he says, no, don't tell them they made a mistake. Just compare the spectrum, and that's fine. And then Krasnopolsky came through the next summer and said that he'd got our preprint in his mailbox and missed his subway stop going home. One time, Charles Barth said, "We don't turn data in. We turn data into science here, into knowledge. Turn data into knowledge." And I said, "How do we do that?" Give the data to a graduate student. Thank you.
I'll do my best to be brief. I can't tell you all my good stories with Barth, and I do have some good ones. There's one really good one where we raced into Mexico. We had rental cars and we raced out in the desert. Another good one where we raced Jeff Bland at Poker Flats. That time Barth was in the same car as me. He let me steer, but he wouldn't let me shift gears. He did that himself. One good one where we were in a restaurant once. He didn't think I was being bold enough in the way I flirted with the waitress. So he started writing down what I should say and making me read the lines. The lines were good. My delivery didn't hold up. But so I have some funny ones, but I can't help but to take a moment and be a little bit serious and say exactly what Barth meant to me. Everybody who knows me knows that Barth meant a lot to me. We spent a lot of time together over the years. And you guys also, those of you who know me, things have gone pretty well for me since I came here, since before I came here. I was lucky to work with some great people, and the career has gone really well. And I want to say a little bit about what role Barth played in that, because I think you all also know Barth is not the type to sit down and teach you physics, right? Most of us who work with Barth worked with several people. But Barth did play a role, and there were some things he did with me. Maybe other people's stories are similar, but some small things he said in important times that just really hit me hard and played a big role. The kind of example I'm talking about is my first semester here, taking final exams. I was not that great of a student. I thought I was in my last days. I have office mates like Frank and Bob Portman, and I didn't think I could ever be like them. I thought I was toast. And one day as I'm preparing for the final exams and particularly depressed about it, Barth walks in with a rocket proposal that he had submitted last time. And he goes, I want you to get all this stuff you're dealing with now out of the way so we can work on this together when you're done. And I was like, you want to work with me? I mean, you even think like that? And I didn't study as much as I could because I read that proposal and I had to do some library work to figure out what he was talking about. But I got through the exams and I got through a lot more. That little oomph he gave me got me over a big hump. And there's lots more like that, times where things were not really going well. And, you know, he had to have a talk with me, that finger in the face talk that some of us have probably experienced. But he always ended it with, next time it's going to go better. Next time you're going to do this. And that was what I latched onto, that's a next time, right? Because at the beginning of the speech, I thought I was in big trouble, but he always ended with next time. And I say that not so much to tell you about me, not so much because I think my story is unique, because I think my story is common. I think there's a lot of stuff like that where Barth, in subtle ways, said just the right thing at the right time and had big impacts on people. And I have to go back to the Snowy experience, right? Students building a satellite, this was in 1995 when we submitted our proposal and won it. When Barth came to us a year before, right, people like Mike McGrath and Jim Westphal, we spent a year writing that proposal. And I remember, as he said it, we're going to build the whole thing ourselves, every aspect of it, the solar power, the instruments, the pointing. None of us had done anything like that. Mike McGrath, who ran the engineering division even back then, they hadn't done that. The first reaction was, you're right. But we worked at it. And it was that knowledge that Barth was saying, you can do it. You can do it. And you've heard this theme in a couple other talks. If he says we can do it, we can do it. Right? And we moved on. We wrote the proposal. We won the proposal. Students came along to actually build it under the supervision of the people who a year earlier were nervous about whether they could do it. Now it's the students doing it. And the students, young though they were, you know, far away in age from Barth, still picked up on, this is Charles Barth. This is an important guy who does important things, and he's telling us we can pull this off. And so we're gonna. And there are a few of those students here in this room. There are a few more spread all over the country doing all kinds of cool jobs. I think it was Barth and the way he dealt with us and the faith he had in us, you know, really unwavering. Because I can think at times he should not have been faithful on me, but he still was. And I think a lot of people would feel that way. That his stature, the high standards he set, and that belief that we are going to succeed, it just affected a lot of people. And I think there are a lot of people who owe a lot about their careers thanks to that optimism he had. I should point out Rick was with me in those races, right? So I'm telling the truth. Which I won. Both of them. I'm not going to agree with the weight test. Thank you for listening to me again.
So, just a few minutes left before we want to start the other talks. And I started working as an undergraduate student in 1965, in March, months before Barth came, and was working predominantly in the rocket side. And so you can imagine after 50 years I have a lot of stories to tell, but I'll be very brief with just 3. I want to follow what Dave Rush had to say, and Sabina and I both share this as well. Sabina's mother was dying, my husband was dying, just months before we got to the Galileo encounter with Jupiter. And Charlie Barth said, go, you need to go. You need to do that. And so I did. And I don't remember some of the things that went on that month, but those several months as we got into the encounter, I think Kent was there, and of course Charlie and my students, you know, held the place together until I could get back. But just the way he said, you know, you have something more important to do now. Barry Knapp had sent me an email shortly after Charles had passed and said that, similar to the other story about calling up Dave to ask about an ideal instruction, it was always a pleasure being close to where Charles was working, because periodically he'd come over and he'd say, well, how do you do that? Or in particular with the reflectance stuff that we were doing with the Mariner 71 data. What is this Fortran program? How do you make this work? How can I run this thing? You would go into his office and you'd explain what he had asked you about, and then he would tell you what he was doing. And so you were learning from him at the same time that he was learning from you. It was a real handoff. It was a wonderful, wonderful experience. The third thing that I want to say shortly is that if you look around the room, there are not very many women here, and there were not very many women working at the lab at that time. Charles always made sure that we were paid the same as the guys. We were equals, and that was something else that he did that was spectacular. To close, he told me when I retired the first time to get a 0 appointment so that I could come back and do things. And so I did, and then I wrote another proposal and came back again. And so now I'm on 0 appointment for the 4th time. And I'm thinking, was this a curse or was this something, was this good? So I have fond memories of Charles as well. And no, he was a very special person that we don't run into very often in our lives. And we all felt that way. Thank you.
Okay, can everybody hear me?
You bet.
All right, I owe my whole life to LASP. I drove up here, this is not 19, I drove up here in 1965 into the big parking lot at Summers Bosch. Another car drove up with a California license plate. A man with white hair, I think he had white hair then, although those pictures didn't show it, got out. And I had a California license plate, and he introduced himself as Dr. Barth, director of LASP. I was, like Paul, a guy from New York. I had never been to Colorado before. I came here to ski, of course. But I ended up working at LASP starting in about 1965, and that was the most important year of my life. So I met Charlie Barth and started at LASP, and I met Barbara, my first wife. She passed away within a year of Charlie, so within 50, and exactly 50 years later, we're now in 2015, I met Karen here in Colorado, and on August 1st, I start work here again for my second career at LASP, so everything with a new wife. So that was one thing. The only funny thing I really wanted to say is that when I married Barbara and we got married, she wanted me to get a degree fast so I could earn money, because I was almost 30 then. And so I was on the last stage of my thesis, which was a nitric oxide calibration to calibrate the photomultiplier that measured the Lyman-Birch-Hoffield bands that I've been trying to measure again and again for the last 50 years, but that was the first time. And Ken Kelly worked with me, and I had to pump nitric oxide through this cell. And I was not a very good experimentalist then, and Kent left the room, and the pump broke. And the nitric oxide got out through the whole lab, and into the vents, and down into the director's office. And they evacuated all of LASP, and then the firemen came into LASP, you know, back there on campus with their hatchets. And Charlie sat there in his office through this whole ordeal, and they finally stopped the pump and got the nitric oxide. So from then on, every day when I came into work at LASP, people said to me, okay, Agello, what do you got planned for us today? And so I almost didn't live that down. And then my final story is when I got my degree and I finally had a chance to get a job, and I took a year in France, I wrote Charlie and Barbara said it's not a good idea. The Europeans don't understand when you leave the country and don't have a job to come back to. They would never come here without a job to go back to in France, but I did. But I had an understanding that I would work on Mariner 8. And so I was in France, and one of the technicians came in, and I didn't speak very good French. He goes, Mariner 8 dans la mer. So I went home and told Barbara that, you know, it's kind of iffy. Well, Mariner 9 made it. I got a job at JPL, and I've been there for 44 years, but I remember the first day there, which was when Mariner 9 made Encounter with Mars, and we had for a data collection a brush recorder, and the thing was running along at 0, and all of a sudden the UV spectrometer was looking at Mars, and the signal went up, and the Cameron bands were coming in, and Charlie was elated, and so I should tell him that yesterday I went in the lab again here at LASP and finally got to measure the Cameron bands with the MAVEN instrument, and so some things turn around and come back. So,
I'll just say in summary, Isaac Newton said that if he saw so far, it was because he stood on the shoulders of giants. I haven't seen all that far. In fact, I've been down here hoping the giants don't step on me. But I've known 3, I'm going to add a 4th. My thesis advisors back in Belfast, David Bates and Alex Delgarno, were the very highest rank. Charlie Barth is that stature in my mind, certainly in a different field. And I have to throw in Bill Fasty because he really was a giant. Taller than me, and must have outweighed me by 100 pounds, and was just a delightful guy. But Charles Barth was a giant in every respect, and we're all by far the richer, and the scientific enterprise by far the richer for his presence. Thank you all.